I am going to start my talk tonight with a few questions to you in the audience, and all that I require is a simple yes answer. First question is, or was, do any of you have one or more tattoos? All right, great. Do you feel that your tattoos might embody your spiritual values, or perhaps they might mark important milestones in your life? All right, awesome, awesome. And last question is, do you feel that your tattoos are part of your identity and that they have important stories to tell about who you are to others? All right, great. You're in very fabulous company. For the nearly 20 years as a tattoo anthropologist, I've been recording similar tattoo meanings amongst the world's indigenous peoples who are ultimately responsible for inventing tattooing in the first place. And this all began on remote St. Lawrence Island in 1997 when I was a graduate student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and I journeyed there to St. Lawrence Island and Bering Strait to record the stories and meanings behind the last generation of tattoo bearers, who were 8 women, all in their 80s and 90s. Now, on St. Lawrence Island, tattooing was applied through a very painful technique of needle and thread, or skin stitching, which that's actually my thigh being skin stitched. Now, I have about 7 hours of that. I'm like a participant observer, as we learn in anthropology. But ultimately, it's a very slow and tedious technique, and it actually took many, many sittings with a female tattoo artist, in fact, many years before a woman received a full complement of tattoo designs that were related to her family and clan lineage, like social exploits and accomplishments of family members. There were also tattoos that marked important rite of passage ceremonies, and there were other tattoos that cured infertility problems for women, and there were still more designs that were believed to repel the advances of malevolent spirits that were thought to be the harbingers of disease. Now, these women were extremely proud of their tattooing traditions because there's nothing else like them in the world, and they're also very happy that somebody was recording this knowledge for future generations. But at the same time, they were very saddened because that they knew that they were the last generation of tattoo bearers, and this is a practice that spans some 2,500 years of cultural history on St. Lawrence Island. Now, missionaries arrived around 1900, and they began to compel many families to stop these practices of disfigurement. And in 1923, the last group of women were tattooed. Now, in St. Lawrence Island, tattooing was ultimately a visual language of communication that spoke about the different ways that the St. Lawrence Islanders engaged with and understood their social, physical, and spiritual worlds, but also what ultimately made them human. For example, 94-year-old Anna Oktakayak told me that it was only because of her tattoos that she was recognized as a true woman in the eyes of her community, and that after death, it was only because of her tattoos that her ancestors could recognize her. Now, these women made me recognize that there were perhaps many other indigenous cultures around the world whose tattooing traditions were rapidly vanishing. And shortly thereafter, I became obsessed, totally possessed, to learn about the motivations and meanings behind the world's indigenous tattooing cultures. And then I started traveling. I hit the road, and I worked with indigenous tattoo artists like Amon Barita, who is actually a practicing shaman. But his tattoos are believed to keep a person's soul in harmony with the universe. I worked with other tattooed elders like Yang Yum, and she told me that her tattoos were the only possessions that she could take with her into the afterlife. I've also worked with many former warriors, a lot of headhunters, like Lalong, and he told me that basically I was marked because of my achievements in the field of battle and hand-to-hand combat, and he had taken several lives in the past. Now, I've journeyed to many other cultures, and I've learned that among some tribes, like the Kayan, there are certain forms of tattooing that is employed sort of like as a medicinal therapy, something akin to acupuncture-like therapy that are placed on the joints. And then there's still more places I traveled to, and I learned that there were sort of magical forms of tattooed ornament. Now, you might be asking, Lars, what are you talking about? Magical forms of tattooed adornment? Well, I'm going to tell you about right now. Okay. So in 2002, I journeyed to Sarawak, or Malaysian Borneo, to work with the Skrong River Iban tribe. And I met these 2 remarkable men, the late Aki Basai and his adopted son, Dongao. Now, if you look very closely at their faces, they have tattooed eyebrows. Now, these are not cosmetic tattoos. They're actually potent love charms, and women would just simply give in to their advances and their desires and fall into their arms. So that's some potent tattooed love magic, right? Okay. Now, I was actually in Borneo as part of the National Geographic documentary called The Vanishing Tattoo, which was actually hosted by two Canadians, writer Vincent Hemmingson and Thomas Lockhart, who's a tattooist, and both of them are based in Vancouver. Now, I was there as a still cameraman, but one of the most important people that we came to interview and meet was the last tattoo artist and designer, Mong. And I was actually traveling with two of his younger relatives, Simon and Eddie David. David's pictured here, and both of them are tattooists in their own right. And as I said, they're distant relatives of Mong. Now, we knew that Mong was dying of cancer. He was very, very elderly. He was 87 years old. And when we entered his room, he was curled up in the fetal position, lying on the floor. He was covered with a simple blanket that smelled of urine. We learned that he was losing his bodily functions. He had refused to eat for several days because he was waiting to journey to the land of the dead, Sebayan, to meet his ancestors. And he was surrounded by a group of female relatives who were sobbing and whispering amongst each other. And one of them bent over to Mong and whispered in his ear that Simon and Eddie and a stranger were here, and they'd come to greet him. And the man, I thought he was already dead. And he slowly rose and came back to life. He sat up and he instantly recognized Simon and Eddie, and a huge grin spread across his face. And actually, we shot some footage of this moment. And because the main body of the film crew was at another location, all we had was like a simple first-generation HD camera that had one stark bulb on it that sort of cast this eerie halo of light around Mong. Now, Mong said we could ask him any question that we wanted to. And so for the next 3 hours, he regaled us with his incredible tales of warfare, magic, and tattoo. But he told us that when he was a young man, he was approached by a tutelary spirit. Not only the great Iban tattoo masters had these tutelary spirits that visited people in waking visions and dreams. And when he was probably in his late teens, this tutelary spirit approached him and said, "Go into the jungle, cut open a particular tree, and inside of it you're going to find a magical amulet that you dip in every batch of tattooing pigment you ever make, because it would render those tattoos with magical, protective qualities." Now, like Aki Basai with the magical eyebrows, Mong was an Iban ranger who fought during World War II against Japanese forces. And they were armed only with simple, well, not I would say simple, but spears, blowguns, and swords against heavy Japanese machine guns, flamethrowers, grenades, pistols. Now, Mong marked many men in this elite fighting corps of Iban Rangers with protective tattoos. And of the 55 Scrang Iban World War II veterans, all but one came back to the Scrong completely unharmed and not hit by any bullets. And the story goes that the one man that was missing in action actually met a beautiful Malaysian girl, moved to the capital, had a huge family, and was the most successful businessman ever on the Scrong. Now, so he's describing the bullets like going around my head, like, and they just completely would miss us because of the magic of my tattoos. Now, so after this incredible interview, we bedded down for the night. And the next morning, we heard a knock at our door, and this woman entered, and she said that Mong had passed away in his sleep. Now, we learned what this magical amulet was, but we did not get to see it because just a few weeks before, his son was converted to Christianity by evangelical missionaries, and they compelled him to throw his father's tattooing equipment and charm in the Scrong River, which you can see right there. But I'll tell you this amulet was extraterrestrial in origin, and it was a meteorite. Now, missionization has been at the very heart of the eradication and demise of tattooing cultures worldwide, but so too have epidemic diseases, forced relocation of indigenous tribes to reservations, government suppression of religious practices, and here in Canada and the United States, the residential school system that forcibly removed hundreds of thousands of children to boarding schools where indigenous languages were banned and their indigenous cultural practices and identity were ultimately stripped away from them so that they could be assimilated into Western culture. However, in many of the regions where missionaries arrived 100, even 200 years ago, tattooing continues to persist. And one of these hot spots is actually in the northern Philippines, specifically in Kalinga province, where perhaps the world's oldest active tattoo artist, 96-year-old Wang Od, continues to apply time-worn patterns to all kinds of different clients. Now here in Kalinga, women traditionally receive tattoos to increase their fertility, their beauty, and in the case of Machao, who's pictured here, to receive medicinal tattoos to prevent goiter, which is an iodine deficiency very prevalent in this region. Whereas Kalinga men were tattooed for their exploits in the field of battle. Specifically, a man had to take another man's life, and especially his head. Now today, there are only 20 of these men approximately that are marked, and the last time they were legally able to take human heads was during World War II. So again, these are all World War II veterans we're talking about, and they have remarkable stories to tell. I don't have time, unfortunately, to share those with you tonight, but... Well, we documented Wang Od's story to the world in the 2009 Discovery Channel series Tattoo Hunter, which I actually hosted. And since that time, she's become sort of a legendary rock star in the international tattooing community, and especially in the Philippines. And now up to 20 visitors from the Philippines typically journey to her very remote village of Buscalan because they want a tattoo to reassert their Filipino roots. Whereas other Kalinga people from distant and neighboring villages want to get a tattoo to reassert their indigenous Kalinga identity. But now there are international tattoo travelers who come to her village because they want to get a tattoo since her tattoos are believed to embody great spirituality, but also they just want a remarkable souvenir to remind them of their incredible times with Wang Od and the Kalinga. Now, she continues to apply tattoos in the traditional Kalinga technique of hand tapping, which is very painful. It's also fairly slow. But because she is the last Kalinga tattoo master, she is very worried about what will happen after she passes away. So for this reason, for the last 10 or so years, she's been apprenticing her great-niece Grace and another relative to take over after she's gone. And she says of Kalinga tattooing, if it will stop, we will lose an important part of our culture and tradition that has been handed down from generation to generation. It's our ancestors' legacy to us, and it defines who we are as a people. So I believe that Kalinga tattooing must forever live among us because without it, we will lose our identity. Now, in the Kalinga lexicon of tattooing designs, we know that there are approximately 50 named patterns and dozens of mythological traditions and epic poems called ulalam that are tied to particular designs. However, there are many other designs that probably have not been recorded or others that have simply been lost to time. And this is sort of the story of the world's indigenous tattooing cultures. Today, there are perhaps tens of thousands of named tattoo designs, thousands of mythological traditions and related stories that are simply not being recorded, and they're vanishing very, very rapidly. And really, nobody's doing much about it. You know, linguists the world over talk about how one indigenous language goes extinct every 14 days. And that by the end of the century, roughly half of the world's 6,000 languages will disappear forever. But what about the vanishing visual language of indigenous tattooing? Well, we have no statistics. We really don't know what's being lost and what rate, and it makes me very, very worried because international organizations like UNESCO, national science foundations, and other research institutes are doing virtually nothing to record this incredible cultural heritage. And perhaps by the time I finish my talk tonight, dozens of indigenous elders around the world who are the last gatekeepers of tattooing knowledge will die without having their knowledge adequately recorded. So, you can probably understand why I'm so passionate and dedicated to this research, because I want to promote awareness of what is being lost, but also what can be regained if tattooing knowledge is documented and preserved for future generations, especially by those who want to reclaim it in order that they can revive these traditional practices. Like Tla'aqueña tattoo artist Dion Casas of Salmon Arm, British Columbia, who is on a mission to bring back the once extinct tattooing traditions of his people. He says, "For me, the magic of the Tla'aqueña tattoo revival is empowering indigenous peoples to embody their identity and indigeneity and to take ownership of their tattooing cultures once again." Tlingit tattoo artist Nahan, who works across Southeast Alaska, says of the family and clan crest designs that he creates, Tlingit tattooing is a sign of genealogy, roots, ancestry, talents, and history. My goal is to instill pride in our ancestral ways of life through tattooing, especially because it is a visual record of our historical lineages and our life achievements. It has been a part of who we have been since time began. Nunavut-based filmmaker Alethea Arnakuk-Baril has described her journey to reclaim the once extinct Inuit tattoo in her 2010 groundbreaking documentary, Tunit. She says of her journey, "It has marked my body and soul, but I love it that my children will grow up thinking my tattoos are natural and that they're just part of my face." So this is my call to action tonight. We as a society need to do more to document and preserve this endangered body of incredible artistic, cultural, and religious heritage before it disappears forever. Because the study of ancient tattooing practices has an important role to play in connecting us all to a deeper understanding of our own cultural history and especially our humanity. Thank you.